The power of a woman's faith, how one wife's belief can build a man's success. The morning sun rose lazily over the quiet neighborhood, washing the cracked streets of Maplewood Avenue in shades of gold and grey. Inside a modest two-bedroom house at the end of the lane sat David Carter, once a man full of ambition, now drowning in silence. The kitchen smelled of burnt coffee and yesterday's worry. Bills lay unopened on the table, each one shouting the same cruel truth: past due. David stared at them like they were enemies. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped another envelope, the frustration tightening in his chest. Only a year ago, he was the kind of man people admired. Sharp, confident, the talk of every business circle in town. He had quit his stable job as an engineer to start his own renewable energy company, convinced he was destined for something greater. But destiny, it seemed, had other plans. Abbott investment, a dishonest partner, and a market crash later. Everything was gone. His business, his savings, his confidence, even the sparkle in his eyes. What remained was a man stripped to the bone by failure. Across the room, his wife, Maria Carter, quietly folded laundry on the couch. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost meditative. She was aware of the storm inside her husband, but chose not to step into it just yet. Maria had learned that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. David finally slammed the last bill down. "Do you know what it feels like?" he muttered. "To give everything you have and still lose." Maria looked up gently. "Yes," she said softly. "It feels like the end. But sometimes it's just the beginning." He laughed bitterly. "You and your optimism. You think believing in something makes it real." She didn't flinch. "No, but I think not believing guarantees failure." Her calm tone frustrated him even more. He stood, pacing the small kitchen, running his hands through his hair. "You don't get it, Maria. I'm done. No one will hire me now. I'm the man who failed at his own dream. Who wants to work with that?" Maria placed the folded shirt aside and walked to him. She didn't argue. She didn't preach. She simply said, "You're not done. You're just in between chapters." But David wasn't ready to hear wisdom. Not now. He grabbed his coat and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The echo lingered long after he was gone. That night, Maria sat by the window, a cup of tea in her hands, staring into the dark sky. She had known David for 10 years, long enough to recognize that his pride hurt more than his failure. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry at himself. She opened her small notebook, the one she kept for moments like this, and began to write. "When the world doubts you, I still believe, because I see the man you are, not the mistakes you made." She tore the note from the page, folded it neatly, and slipped it into David's wallet while he slept. It wasn't the first note she had written, and it wouldn't be the last. Every morning before he woke, she'd leave little reminders hidden around the house, under his coffee mug, inside his lunch bag, tucked into his jacket pocket. Words of quiet strength for a man who had forgotten his own. Days turned into weeks. David stopped going out. He barely spoke. The once lively man who could light up a room now sat for hours staring into space. He told Maria to stop trying, to stop pretending that everything would be fine. But she never stopped believing. One evening, while rummaging through his wallet at a gas station, David found her note. His hands froze as he read the words, "When the world doubts you, I still believe." He folded it again, slower this time. For a moment, something stirred in his chest, something he hadn't felt in months. A flicker, a whisper, hope. He didn't say anything to Maria that night, but he kept the note in his pocket. Every time the darkness crept in, he'd touch it. And for reasons he couldn't explain, it helped him breathe a little easier. Weeks later, David received a call from an old friend. There was a small engineering firm looking for a temporary consultant. Nothing fancy, low pay, but it was something. Still, David hesitated. His pride wrestled with his desperation. "A consultant," he muttered. "That's a polite way of saying you failed, but we'll pity hire you." Maria smiled softly. Or maybe it's a way of saying, "Here's another chance." He wanted to believe her. He really did. But fear had built thick walls around his mind. That night, as Maria slept, he sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at her handwriting on that tiny folded paper. He realized something. She wasn't believing for him. She was believing with him. And that made all the difference. The next morning, David decided to take the consulting job. The firm was small, the office old, but the work reignited a part of him that had been buried under failure. He began sketching ideas again, scribbling designs for energy-efficient models in his notebook during lunch breaks. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about rediscovering himself. Each evening he came home a little less broken. Maria noticed. She never asked how his day went. She could read it in his eyes. The way they softened when he saw her told her everything. Still, challenges loomed. Bills didn't stop coming. The savings were gone. Sometimes they had dinner with only half a loaf of bread and a bowl of soup. Yet through it all, Maria remained unshaken. One night, when David couldn't sleep, he overheard Maria whispering to herself in the dark, "I don't know how, but we'll make it. Because I still believe." He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the words echoing in his mind. It wasn't just her faith that moved him. It was a quiet courage to keep loving a man who had stopped loving himself. By the end of that year, David's small consulting job turned into a permanent role. He didn't celebrate it like a victory, but Maria did. She baked a small loaf of sweet bread, placed a candle in it and said, "For new beginnings." He laughed, for the first time in months. It wasn't a grand moment, but sometimes hope doesn't come roaring like thunder. It whispers, softly, through the voice of someone who refuses to give up. The winter wind howled through the thin windows of the Carter home. The heater had broken 2 weeks ago, and the repair bill sat on the kitchen counter, mocking them in silence. Maria wore 2 sweaters as she stirred a pot of soup, their 3rd night in a row eating the same meal. But she didn't complain. She hummed softly instead, her voice calm against the chaos of their reality. David sat at the table, staring at the steam rising from his bowl. His consulting job had ended abruptly when the company cut costs. They told him he'd done excellent work, but excellence didn't pay rent. The room was heavy with unspoken worry, the kind of silence that stretched between 2 people who loved each other deeply, but didn't know how to fix what life had broken. Maria finally said, "We'll get through this, David." He didn't respond right away. He was tired of hearing it. Those words, though kind, sounded like lies now. He looked up and said bitterly, "You said that last month, and the month before. When does it stop being words, Maria? When does it become real?" Her heart sank, but she didn't lash back. "When we stop giving up," she whispered. He pushed his bowl away. "You think faith can feed us? You think hope can pay bills?" Maria met his eyes. "No, but giving up won't either." Her words hung in the air like smoke, invisible but choking. David stood up, frustrated, and walked out to the porch. The cold hit his face, reminding him how small he felt in the world. A week later, things got worse. The landlord handed them an eviction notice, 2 weeks to pay or leave. David walked home that evening with his shoulders slumped and his spirit hollow. He dreaded telling Maria. He knew how hard she was trying, baking small batches of bread, selling to neighbors, barely making a few dollars a day. When he told her, she didn't cry. She simply nodded, her jaw tightening for the first time. Then she said something he didn't expect. "We're not leaving. I'll bake more. You'll find something. I believe that." He wanted to argue. He wanted to yell at the world, at fate, at himself. But the quiet determination in her voice stopped him. There was a strange kind of power in her belief, the kind that didn't demand proof to exist. That night, Maria stayed up until midnight baking. The smell of warm bread filled the small kitchen, soft and comforting. David watched her from the doorway. Her hands were tired, her eyes red, but she kept working, kneading dough, shaping loaves, humming softly. He realized then that her faith wasn't built on naivety. It was built on love. Love strong enough to push through exhaustion. The next morning, Maria carried her baskets down the street to sell. David stood by the window, watching her walk away in the cold, wearing the same worn-out coat she'd had for years. Something inside him twisted. Shame, maybe. Guilt, definitely. He picked up his phone and scrolled through old contacts, desperate for leads. He saw a number he hadn't dialed in months. An old college friend, now a foreman at a construction company. David hesitated, pride whispering, "Don't do it." But he thought of Maria, out there in the cold, trying to keep them afloat. He dialed the number. "Hey, Mark," he said quietly. "You got any openings? I'll take anything." There was a pause on the line. Then Mark replied, "We could use a site hand for now. Not engineering work, but it's something." David hesitated. A construction site? Manual labor? After years as an engineer, it felt humiliating. But he heard Maria's words echo in his mind. "When we stop giving up." He swallowed hard. "I'll take it." The first day on the construction site was rough. His hands blistered, his back ached, and the younger workers laughed at the old guy struggling to lift crates. He could have quit. But every time he thought about walking away, he pictured Maria's tired hands kneading dough at midnight. At lunch, he sat alone, eating a sandwich Maria had packed for him. When he unwrapped it, a small folded paper fell out. He opened it. "Your work doesn't define your worth. Your effort does." David smiled weakly. Even here, even in his lowest place, she found a way to remind him that he wasn't done yet. A few weeks later, while reviewing the layout of some solar panels at the site, David noticed a technical flaw. It was the kind of mistake only someone with an engineering background would catch. He approached the site manager, an older man named Mr. Thompson, and carefully pointed it out. The man raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You know your stuff." "I used to be an engineer," David said, embarrassed. "Had my own company once." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly. "What happened?" David hesitated. "It fell apart. I fell apart." The old man studied him for a moment and said, "Maybe you just needed to rebuild." Over the next few days, Mr. Thompson started asking David for input on small, technical decisions. David didn't realize it, but his confidence began to return, little by little. Afternoon, Mr. Thompson invited him into his office trailer. "You ever think about trying again?" he asked. David chuckled. "With what? I barely have enough money to keep the lights on." Mr. Thompson smiled. "Sometimes, ideas are worth more than money." He pulled out a folder and placed it on the desk. "Show me what you've been working on." David frowned. "How did you—" "I saw you sketching during lunch breaks," Mr. Thompson said. "You've got vision, son. Don't hide it." David hesitated, then slowly opened his notebook. Inside were his old designs for low-cost solar devices, ideas he'd buried after his company failed. Mr. Thompson looked through them carefully. "You're onto something here. If you can refine this, I might know someone willing to invest." David's heart pounded. He hadn't heard the word invest in years. That evening he came home quiet. Maria noticed the difference immediately. There was something new in his eyes. a light she hadn't seen in months. "How was your day?" she asked, wiping flour from her hands. He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Maybe better than yesterday." She smiled back. She didn't press for details. She didn't need to. Sometimes silence carried the loudest hope. But as life often does, the test wasn't over. A week later, Mr. Thompson's contact delayed funding, and the opportunity slipped through David's fingers. He came home that night, defeated, all over again. "I thought this was it," he whispered. "I thought maybe this time." Maria took his hands and looked into his tired eyes. "Then we try again," she said softly. He looked at her in disbelief. "How do you keep believing when everything keeps falling apart?" She smiled faintly. "Because I see what's possible, not what's painful." That night, David sat at the table staring at his designs. For the first time, he didn't see failure, he saw potential. He realized that Maria's faith wasn't meant to replace his. It was meant to reignite it. He whispered to himself, "Maybe she's right. Maybe this isn't over." And for the first time in a long while, he started to believe it too. Spring arrived quietly that year. The days grew longer, and so did the list of bills on the Carter kitchen table. But something had changed. Something invisible but powerful. David Carter wasn't the same man who once sat paralyzed by defeat. He had begun working, again, with Mr. Thompson, the retired investor who saw promise in his solar designs. It wasn't official yet, no contracts, no money. But there was hope. Hope. A word that had nearly vanished from his vocabulary. Every morning David woke before sunrise, sketching blueprints, refining measurements, running calculations on an old laptop that barely worked. Maria would wake to find him at the table, a cup of cold coffee beside him, his eyes focused, his heart awake. She never disturbed him. She just smiled quietly, knowing something sacred was happening. A rebirth not of business, but of purpose. Mr. Thompson became more than a mentor. He became a guide. They met 3 times a week in a small office above a hardware store, reviewing prototypes and discussing possibilities. "You've got brilliance, David," Mr. Thompson would say, tapping his pencil on the desk. "You just need belief. You lost faith once. Don't lose it again." David would nod, though deep down he still battled doubt. What if he failed again? What if this was another false start? But then he'd think of Maria, her soft eyes, her steady voice, the quiet strength she carried, even when the world gave her every reason to break. He couldn't fail her again. He wouldn't. Meanwhile, Maria's bakery, the small home venture that started as survival, was slowly becoming something more. Word spread about her bread. Neighbors loved it. Then small cafes began ordering from her. She didn't tell David how much she was earning because it wasn't about money for her. It was about doing something meaningful, something that carried them both. Every evening she'd pack unsold loaves into a basket and deliver them to the shelter down the street. "If we have enough to share," she'd say, "then we're already blessed." David admired her for that. In her simplicity, he found wisdom he couldn't learn from books. One afternoon, while Maria was delivering bread, she stopped by a small cafe. As she handed the owner a warm loaf, she overheard a conversation between 2 men at the counter. One of them, a kind, older gentleman, mentioned investing in renewable energy startups. Maria smiled politely and said, "My husband is working on something like that." The man turned to her, curious. "Oh, really? What kind of work?" She smiled. "Maybe it's not an accident." A week later, David met Paul Thompson, a man of few words but sharp vision. Paul listened carefully as David presented his project, flipping through sketches, cost breakdowns, and community impact plans. When David finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Paul said, "You've got something powerful here. I can help you launch it, but I need assurance that you're ready to lead again. You can't build a dream halfway." David took a deep breath. "I've been halfway all my life," he said quietly. "This time, I'm going all in." Paul nodded. "Good. Then let's begin." Weeks turned into months. The Carters' life began to shift, slowly but surely. David worked long hours with both Thompsons, finalizing designs, testing prototypes, and preparing a presentation for investors. Maria continued baking, her business expanding faster than she expected. Sometimes they'd sit together late at night, exhausted but fulfilled. Their conversations were no longer about fear. They were about plans, about possibilities, about tomorrow. But success rarely comes without another storm. Just days before their investor pitch, a critical component of the solar prototype failed. Repairs would cost thousands, money they didn't have. David sat at his desk, head in his hands. The old fear returned, that paralyzing sense of failure creeping up his spine. Maria found him there, silent, broken. He muttered, "It's over again, Maria. I can't fix it. We're done." She walked up behind him and placed her hands on his shoulders. "No," she said firmly, "you're not done. You're tested." He looked up at her, eyes tired and angry. "You don't understand. We need money, parts, time. We don't have any of it." Maria knelt beside him. "Then we'll find it, the same way we always do, by refusing to give up." The next morning, Maria did something bold. She gathered her courage and went to Mr. Thompson's office. "Mr. Thompson," she said gently, "I know David hasn't told you, but he's worried. The prototype broke, and we don't have the funds for repairs. But please, don't give up on him." The old man looked at her, surprised by her honesty. "You came all the way here to tell me that?" She nodded. "He won't ask for help because his pride won't let him. But I've seen him fight too hard to stop now." Mr. Thompson smiled. "You remind me of someone I used to know, my late wife. She believed in me long before I believed in myself." He reached for the phone and made a call. "Paul, get the parts ordered. We'll cover it." Maria exhaled in relief. As she turned to leave, Mr. Thompson said softly, "Now I see where David's strength really comes from." That evening, when David returned home, Mr. Thompson called to tell him the good news. "Your wife came by," he said. "She's something special, son. Don't ever doubt that." David's heart swelled. He turned to Maria, who was kneading dough at the counter, pretending nothing had happened. "You went to him, didn't you?" She smiled without looking up. "Maybe." He walked up behind her, resting his forehead on her shoulder. "I don't deserve you." Maria laughed softly. "Then deserve yourself. That's all I ever wanted." Weeks later, the prototype was repaired. The investor meeting went better than anyone expected. Within months, funding was secured, and production began on a small scale. David's invention, a simple solar kit designed for rural homes, started gaining attention. Local newspapers ran stories about the Carter project. Suddenly, the same man who once felt invisible was being recognized as a pioneer of affordable energy. Through it all, Maria never took credit. She simply stood by, smiling from the shadows, watching her husband step into the light she always knew was his. Beautiful. Here's the grand finale. The summer air was warm and soft, carrying the scent of sun and promise. For the first time in years, the Carters' home didn't feel heavy with worry. It felt alive, filled with laughter, light, and the quiet hum of gratitude. David stood by the window one morning, holding a letter from a major energy organization. His hands trembled slightly as he read the words again. "Congratulations. Your project has been selected for the National Innovation Award." He couldn't believe it. The dream that had once crumbled beneath debt and doubt was now rising stronger than ever. Behind him, Maria wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and smiled. "What does it say?" He turned to her, tears forming in his eyes. "It says, we did it." She covered her mouth with her hand, laughter and disbelief mixing together. "You did it, David." He shook his head. "No, Maria. We did." The award ceremony was held 2 weeks later in a grand auditorium filled with entrepreneurs, investors, and journalists. Cameras flashed, applause thundered, and David Carter, once the man who couldn't find his footing, stood on stage as a symbol of perseverance. As he walked to the microphone, he felt his heart racing. He looked down at the crowd and, there in the front row, was Maria. Her hands clasped, her smile steady, her eyes glistening with pride. He took a deep breath. "I was asked tonight to talk about innovation," he began, "but I think it's more important to talk about belief." The room quieted. There was a time when I thought failure was the end of me. When I lost my business, I didn't just lose money. I lost myself. And when I stopped believing, someone else believed for me. His voice caught slightly, and he looked directly at Maria. She reminded me that real strength isn't in never falling. It's in standing again after you've been broken. Her faith became my foundation. Every idea, every design, every small success came from one truth. But when one person keeps believing in you, even when you can't, it changes everything. The audience erupted in applause. Maria's tears finally fell, but her smile never faded. That night, after the ceremony, they drove home in silence. The city lights shimmered through the windshield, reflecting off the tears David hadn't bothered to wipe away. Maria reached over and took his hand. "You spoke beautifully tonight." He smiled faintly. "I just told the truth." A few months later, David used a portion of his award grant to launch a small foundation. One that provided low-cost solar kits to communities without power. But that wasn't all. He surprised Maria by naming the foundation after her bakery, the Rising Loaf Initiative. When she asked why, he smiled and said, "Because everything that rose from our struggle started in this kitchen, with your bread, your hands, your hope." Maria laughed through tears. "You're impossible." "Maybe," he said, "but so are miracles." As the years passed, the Carters became local legends, not for wealth but for impact. David's company grew modestly, focusing on service more than fame. Maria expanded her bakery into a small chain, employing women who had also faced hardship. Their story spread. A story not of luck, but of loyalty. Not of sudden success, but of steady belief. Sometimes, Maria would find herself standing at the counter of her bakery, watching young couples come in hand, full of dreams and fears. She would smile and think to herself, if only they knew how much belief it takes to build something that lasts. One evening, years after that first note she had written him, Maria found herself cleaning out an old drawer. Among the scraps of paper and forgotten receipts, she found a small folded slip, the one she had written long ago. "When the world doubts you, I still believe." Her eyes filled as she read the faded words. She walked into David's study, where he was sketching another design, older now but still passionate. She placed the note in front of him. "Remember this?" He smiled, touching the worn paper. "How could I forget? That's where everything started." She tilted her head. "You kept it all these years?" He nodded. "It was my blueprint before I ever drew another one." That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat together on the porch, the same porch where, years ago, David had once sat in silence, drowning in self-doubt. Now, he sat in peace. The crickets sang, the stars emerged, and the world felt still. David turned to Maria. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think success was about being the best. But now I know it's about becoming your truest self. And having someone who believes in that version of you, even when you can't see it." Maria smiled. "That's what faith does. It doesn't wait for proof. It creates it." They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind only two souls who had fought life side by side could share. Months later, David's project reached international recognition. But even as the world praised him, he always redirected the spotlight. Every interview, every article, he never failed to mention Maria. When a journalist once asked him, "What's the secret behind your success?" he replied simply, "A woman who refused to stop believing."